kind of the palimpsest of kind of Jewish culture existing as this extremely important trope, but not particularly in music, even though everything is music for a musician. So food is definitely music. Jokes are unquestionably music. Language is more music than music most of the time. So, like, especially when you have two languages going together or three, like jazz language, Yiddish, and whatever you want to call English, if they're going together, like that's totally music. Like I say, that's better music than most music. So that was what it was for like a really long time until it changed, and how it changed was different for each one of us for whom it changed. It changed for everybody in different ways. But very key event was this concert at the Workmen's Circle of Dave Taras, which was a key event for so many people, interestingly enough. Hankus, could you speak to that for a second?
Well, yeah. Dave Taras was the number one American Jewish wedding musician in New York City for a very, very long time, starting in the mid 1920s. He was a great clarinetist. He came from Teplik in the Ukraine. And he had a great recording career and was part of the Abe Schwartz Orchestra for quite a while. Then he was a studio musician for WEVD. So he had a real, what we would call yichus, a real sort of heritage of Jewish music, a lineage. He was part of a serious lineage musically. What happened with klezmer music, so-called klezmer music, was it went out of favor probably by the late 1950s. Through the 60s, there was almost no work except in the Catskills. In the 70s, it was even quieter. But a younger generation came along and started looking for the Jewish version of the Delta blues musicians, I suppose you could
That's
say.
pretty much what it was. Yeah, that's pretty much what it was. And then you started to hear stirrings of it. Like here and there, somebody would mention it, or there were these first couple of albums that collected 78s together. And there were like, I was working in a record store. So there, all the kind of people that, the thing that's so lost with the loss of big record stores is like the kind of people, the kind of, I don't know what to call them. They're not losers. They're not outcasts. They're not nerds. They're sometimes all of the above, and they're also very brilliant. Any of you want to read this wonderful book, it's about bookstores. It's not about bookstores, but a lot of it takes place in the basement of the Strand. It's my brain is not what it used to be, but it's called what's the name of the writer? She's very famous. But the book is called Bad Behavior, and if anybody can remember her name, I'm going to feel really stupid. And I'm not going to get up and look at my bookshelf. Anyway, she spent her early years working in the Strand, and a lot of the book is about the people that work in rare bookstores and like stay in the basement and stuff. And like that's what it was like working in Tower Records. So Lawrence Glamberg was working there when I was working there, and I'm sure a lot of you know who Lawrence Glamberg is. But maybe you could explain who he was for a second and is. Hankus, you're muted. I can't hear you. Hello.
So this is the milieu where Anthony started to discover this music somewhat. And then what happened around 1980, 81 that
Well,
changed,
first,
moved you
so I
along?
first want to talk about this concert because this concert was presented as a concert of klezmer music, which was like a term that started to, and it's so funny because Zev was on that concert, and Zev is often thought of as the man who began to use the term like regularly, or I mean, that's I
This
guess
is Walter Zev Feldman, who took a term that was used by the great ethnomusicologist Beregovsky, which he translated from Russian as Jewish klezmer music, and nobody had ever done that before in English.
and so that's what the poster said, and that's you, Hankus. You have the poster, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. and yeah, and like it was all like it opened up this world because like what was happening was we were always searching for like roots of stuff. like a lot of us were very deep into the roots music of different kinds. A lot with blues, a lot with the early jazz or different kinds of jazz roots and stuff. But like with Jewish music, when I would go to my grandparents' house, like they would listen to WEVD and stuff, and they would listen to the Simcha Hour, and that was some sentimental. Can I curse? Uh, does anybody mind?
You're being recorded.
Yeah, there was some. I just don't want to say it was some sentimental stuff. That's a little weak, for what it was. It was like everything was in the zone of like my Yiddish mama, but not. But it's a lot of Yiddish songs and a lot of Connie Francis and a lot of all kinds of stuff. And then the guy would drone on about funeral parlors for the ads, and dairy restaurants, and it was just kind of whatever. And so that was like, to me, there was nothing that exciting. I mean, it was cultural, but there was nothing to grab me in any kind of way that I would want to get into it. So when I first heard klezmer music, and when I'm talking about, I went to my mother and I said, when you used to go to weddings when you were a kid, like, did they play klezmer music at the weddings? And she said, klezmer music? Are you out of your mind? All they ever played was sentimental songs. And she said, and this was a great thing about my parents, they each knew like 8 words or 2 lines out of about 100 Jewish songs. That was as much, except for raisins and almonds, because my grandmother kind of knew the whole thing, and often prepachik. But outside of that, forget it. It was like I got the literal palimpsest of Jewish culture, which is like really fantastic. It's like I didn't have to read Borges, even though I read Borges all the time, to really discover the palimpsest. The palimpsest was in my own backyard. It was like like my mother said. All they ever sang was "Bells, mein Städel bells," and that's it. She got that far, and that was the end of it. For example, for example, they all had like little bits of stuff. When it came to food or jokes, there they could go through the whole thing and all of the routine and everything. So this is what it was. So it was kind of interesting. And in the next few years there was a bunch of stuff that happened, and Hankus was on his own journey in Philadelphia, collecting stuff in the basement, finding all kinds of things, like, which is a whole story about his family. And out of that, he had started collecting a bunch of. There were 78s in the basement, right? Besides everything else. You're so on mute that I can't. You're not. I can't even tell you how much you're on mute.
Because I'm sorry, I'm sensitive to the background noise, but yes, starting 1974, I started recording my family's collection, and that really led me to the whole thing.
Yeah, so when it happened that I went to Eastern Europe for the first time in 1981, I had this cassette that Hankus had given me. On one side, it was beautifully curated. On one side, it was original 78s from the time, like back in the day, the back in the day 78s. And then the other side was the first recordings of some of the klezmer revival bands, including the klezmorim and so on, and like that. From your neck of the woods, right? I mean,
yeah,
yeah, and like that, and I took this with me, and I ended up, which is a very long story, spending. Well, I met a person, and she and I became engaged, and I ended up getting married, and I ended up having a kid, and we ended up having a kid, and I ended up getting divorced, and so on, so on. But what it meant is I ended up spending a lot of time in the ex-Yugoslavia. I always say it's the greatest line ever that I met my ex-wife from the ex-Yugoslavia in Aix-en-Provence, France, which is true. And and like so I had my cassette traveling through Eastern Europe on the train. It was like one of those kind of mise en scènes that you just can't in 1981. And that cassette just went inside me. It was like by the time I was through that trip, I was just like, that was so like, it became like very conflated the way, like, I think for a lot of people, Balkan music and Jewish music have become conflated, but maybe not in the way that I conflated them.
So, sorry to interrupt. We're getting some questions about maybe could we hear a clip of something like one of these tunes that inspired you?
Well,
Sure.
this is in fact.
Yeah. Okay, but I'm gonna have to dig for 1 second, okay? But happily,
That's interesting. Yeah, we were going to start with one of his tunes, but that's great if you have.
If that's okay.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
for sure,
that's a
sure.
great question.
Uh, I'll definitely play
He's
one
going
of
to
them.
have to get the cassette. He's
Yeah,
going to
yeah,
have to
yeah.
get a
Just hold
cassette
on. It
player.
won't take that long. No, 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 no. Hold on, hold on. The magic of the internet, people. I just got to find a not horrible recording. That's the only thing. You know, that's the secret. Um, 1 minute.
Ah,
Yeah,
Candles Orchestra coming up.
yeah. Okay, Candle. Right. Let's find Candle.
Oh, no, Theodore
No, but I don't
Bickel.
want Theodore
No,
Kill. I
no,
want
we don't
Candle.
want Theodore. Okay.
Candle, baby. Here
I
we
see
go.
it. I
There
see
we
it.
go. There we go. Beautiful. This is perfect. I'll be right back because I want to get the most important one. We got to go to the second section.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to stop there to say something interesting, which I hope is interesting. About 15 years later, when I got commissioned to, okay, so I was working with this choreographer. This is jumping way out of sequence, but just since we played this song, because somebody, I think the question was great. You should jump in at any time with questions because sequence is for sissies. You know what I mean? Like, uh, um, I mean, I want to be like that novel. What's it called? The hopscotch. You read it and you jump all over the place. You read whatever pages, whatever.
Feel
I
free to
want.
put questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring it.
Okay,
Okay.
cool. Let me know. Okay, so apropos of the Mamas Gegangen, I want to say that about 15 years later, after a whole bunch of stuff had gone on, let's say that when I started to write pieces that I contextualized as Jewish music in some way was kind of like the late 80s. But somewhere around the mid 90s, I started working with an Israeli choreographer named Netta Polvamacher. And she'd gotten famous for a piece called Six Beds, which talked about her experience growing up in one of these very lefty, very radical kibbutzes where the children kind of were self-governing, and like the older kids took care of the younger kids from the age of very, very like from almost from birth. And it really was a freaky experience. And she worked with an Israeli composer, Yuval Gabay, on that piece. And then we started to work together, and she never could quite find the intensity of what she had accomplished in Six Beds. And we did a couple of nice pieces together. And then she got really involved in wanting to do a piece about the way the Lower East Side had these traces of Jewish life, but that they were starting, like right across the street from my house was an abandoned synagogue where the roof had collapsed and trees were growing through it, and like stuff like that. It was like abandoned to the point where trees were coming out through the roof, and there were all kinds of haunting images like that all over the Lower East Side and East Village. And just around that time, there were the beginning of all these klezmer festivals and radical Jewish culture festivals, which were in fact very different, but also the same. And that's a whole long story. and too complicated to go into. And people were starting to recreate their history. Like I was always, when I was playing jazz or when I was playing blues, there was always something missing. I always wanted to find something that spoke to me much more deeply, that was much more my music. And then when I found this, I finally found the music that, and I was like, come on, people, like you, like how Hank has said, why don't you think about more like how you join a lot of things together as part of what makes up the whole you rather than this, excuse me, I can't speak without cursing, it's really impossible, this BS creation myth, that doesn't have anything to do with who you really are, where you came from, or but it sounds good and it gives people a lot of good marketing stuff. And so that's how I started the Self-Haters Orchestra, because the whole idea of that was like I wanted to have a klezmer name but that would actually reflect how I grew up. So it was like, you know, so I, like you look at my last name, you don't really have to go much further, but into how this happened. There's like a whole lot of there's that great joke. The four men sit down. I put it in the liner notes. I'm going to read it off the liner notes because I don't want to get it even wrong. Here's the record, the first Self-Haters record, and here's the liner notes. And four
Yeah.
salesmen said, four salesmen who had met on a train began to play cards. Let's introduce ourselves, said one man. My name's Cole. I am Kent, said the second salesman. Carlton, said the third. Also Cohen, added the fourth.
Um,
Also Cohen, yes.
Hey, we weren't able to see the cover just because all of
Uh,
our screens are small right now. Can you stop your screen share so we can all see it?
no, I'm going to do it after because I want to play this track,
Oh,
okay?
gotcha.
Okay, because this is all leading somewhere, okay? So we did the first gig of this at this festival, and it was terrible because it was such a new concept. But I was so in love with what I was trying to do, which were these little shards of klezmer music and stuff, that I said to Netta, if you want to do a piece about this kind of degeneration, I have the perfect music for you. And I played it for her, and she said, I don't know about this music. I said, and I never said this to a choreographer before. I said, it's either this or I don't want to do the project. That's it. It's got to be this. And again, my name with my thing with names is I'm really hating myself. It's like one of the most foremost Jewish short story novel. It's like writers. What's your name? Everybody knows it. It's Goodbye and Good Luck is the story.
Oh, not Grace
Grace
Paley.
Paley. Grace
Yeah.
Paley. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that was the name of the choreographer of the dance piece. Um, and we went through a whole bunch of stuff before it ended up with angels playing broken violins. It was fantastic. But I'm just going to play, and in the piece, I tell the narrative of the story of the man on the train who keeps saying, "Oi, am I thirsty? Oi, am I thirsty?" And finally is given something to drink after a really long time. And after he's had something to drink, he says, "Oi, was I thirsty?" And but it takes me 13 minutes to tell the joke. But the point is, I used the Mama is Gegangen, and in the first version of it, um, I used this. You know how pieces sometimes build to a climax where something that you use as fragments finally gets played all the way through. And then there's other, well, for example, there's a movie by Jean Luc Godard called Sympathy for the Devil, which exists in two versions, Sympathy for the Devil and 1+1. And in one of the versions, the Rolling Stones play the whole Sympathy for the Devil at the end of it. And in the other version, they never play the whole thing. Because it's a real tension. If you show fragments, do you want to have the whole thing at the end or not? This is one of those great questions. And in this, we ended up never playing the whole thing. We did do it in the recording, but when we edited it, it just seemed like too triumphant. But I'll play you the part where you'll see the little fragments of the Mama is Gegangen, okay? It's going to take me a minute to find them. I'm going to start from the beginning of the piece, but then I'll move on to that, okay? So, there was this
old man sitting on a train. And as the train rolled along, every once in a while, the other passengers could hear the old man crying. Oi, am I thirsty? Oi, am I thirsty? Oi, am I thirsty?
So all the music is roughly based on the Mamas Gegangen, but I'm now going to come to the climax for a second. And we're all saying, "Oi, was I thirsty?" Oi, am I thirsty? Excuse me. That's right where it starts. Yeah.
I want to make sure we. Okay.
It's very big
Thank you
smoke
very
bubbles
much,
on
sir.
that comes at the end of
Thank you.
that.
Yes, thank you very much, sir.
That's all. I'm just
Okay.
saying, so much of that material is generated from Die Mama is gegangen in either the rhythm or some of the phrases or like every the Mama. Let's put it this way: I basically treated Die Mama is gegangen like a row, like in like in a serial music way. I took different aspects of it and I fragmented them, whether it was the rhythm or the pitches or different aspects of it, and out of that with the fragmentation of the story, that's how I made the piece.
Yes. So could we hear about Netsky by Night, which is from Disco by Night, when you took that trip to
Sure. Yeah. So
Bosnia,
that was no. I didn't go to Bosnia until
Sarajevo?
much later. No, not till much later.
I
Much
see.
later. Sarajevo, I actually went with Sephardic tinge much later. I didn't
Oh
get to
no.
go to. I went to Sarajevo right at the end of the war, actually, and Sarajevo was extremely damaged when I went. It was really an incredible experience. But in the first trip, the place where I went, which is really relevant, is I went to Dubrovnik, which has one of the oldest synagogues in Europe. And there was the man who was in his 90s, who was the keeper of the synagogue, who was very intensely, um, very intensely deaf. Let's start by saying that. Very intensely deaf. So he screamed a lot. And especially when he met Jewish children visiting from Australia, he screamed a lot and talked a lot about when the absence of a minyan, except in the summertime. And my future wife, who was very interested in the Jewish history of her country but did not know the Jewish history of her country, was way more um, shaken by this experience than I was. I was pretty shaken, but she was way more shaken. And and I started to notice that where there were synagogues, there was always some version of Yevreska Ulica, like Jew Street. There was always a Jew Street near, or whether there was a synagogue, or whether there had been a synagogue, or whether there was a graveyard, or whether there had been a graveyard or a cemetery. There was always a Yevreska Ulica somewhere. And so when I got back that's now I'm talking about the trip from 1981. But then we had a life, we had our life. And in 1987, in the summer of 1987, I went there for my son's first birthday. Originally, I wasn't going to go. My ex wife needed some time away from New York, me, everything. And she went there, and then I was there, and I was going like, "What the hell?" It's my kid's first birthday. I'm going anyway, and it's before the internet. So I just kind of showed up, and I showed up, and everybody got it. It was my kid's first birthday, but at the same time, I think it put the final nail in our marriage coffin. My showing up when she was trying to take some time off, and but at the same time, we were in Montenegro on the coast, and you could feel all the stirrings of what was going down. It was very close to when the country dissolved. So it was one of those experiences where like my personal life was completely crashing, but where I was also collapsing. And it was like more than I could sort of put together all this macro micro stuff. So when I got back, I felt really demolished. I felt really freaked out. And I never really thought about writing Balkan music or anything. But like because I was spending all that time in the Balkans, and I felt like if you really want to know this world, you need to spend time. I decided I would be in the position of a person who's like taking it in and reflecting it as best as they can, whatever's coming through, like the noise that's coming through, kind of as though you have the radio playing 24 hours a day. And so I made this cycle of pieces that have this whole of stream of consciousness of Balkan musical imagery. And that was my first record that I issued as a leader. It's called By Night. because you always used to get these postcards that would have like every Balkan city, and it would have these like weird tableaus of the city by night. It would be like Belgrade by night, but they looked like really kind of, they looked like they could have been shot in the 1950s, even though they were shot then in like the 80s. But there was something about the color, and everything was like super faded. Maybe I'll pull one up so you can see it. It's like they're really, really interesting, those kind of postcards. And I was obsessed with those. I collected them from every place I went. So that's why the cycle became by night. But while I was making the cycle, I realized there needed to be a Jewish piece because of the piece, because of the experience I'd had in um, in
Dubrovnik.
Dubrovnik. So then there's a whole story about the first Jewish music festival at the Knitting Factory, which I will just not tell, but there was the first, like in 1991 and or 87, whatever, sometime between, no, summer of 87, 88, yes, right. Some that, and I wrote a piece for it. I was a band that had Mark Rebo, Roy Nathanson, me, a couple of other people. I guess it was like 87 is when I came back. Like maybe 89 was this concert, something like that. And I decided to write a Jewish by Night piece for it. And so it's like Balkan signifiers with Jewish signifiers together. I'll play it now, okay? Here, it's from this record.
so really captures that feeling of being there at night, I'm sure, and what that felt like to bring back as a memory. Could we hear? Can you talk about S. Brent and that experience?
Yeah, no, that's jumping like almost to the end of my story, you know. And
Well,
but
I just thought that
no. I mean,
it might be a good thing.
I'm
It's very
happy.
different than
I'm
this.
not saying that as a way of saying I don't want to do it. I love the jumping around, but I just have to contextualize it. That's all I'm saying. So a lot of my projects that had engagement with Jewish music did not engage that much with Ashkenaz music. That's what I want to. That's what I need to say. Okay, a lot of them tended to engage with.
Has more than 6 million in its bank accounts, including.
Wow, what was that? Bank accounts, huh? 6 million bank accounts. That's a little bit scary. What the hell? 6 million bank accounts, indeed. Okay, well, why not?
That's okay. You were talking about.
Nothing happens for, and no, there are no accidents. You know what they say. I'm talking about it. All right, whatever. I'm not going to riff out too much on that. I'll pull back. The Cajun in me wants to go crazy, but he won't. A lot of my projects were fringy or tingy in some sense, looking for little nooks and crannies in things. And that's how my project Sephardic Tinge got started, which is a whole other story, which hopefully we'll have time to say a little bit about. But if not, that's life. I have no Sephardic side in my background. It was more because of the elements of Spanish or Hispanic music in the jazz tradition. So that made me interested in how that would function in the Jewish tradition. Also.
Well, if you want to play ghetto first,
No,
that
no,
way I
no,
don't
no, no. I
understand
think
it. Or more
I'm
Anika.
totally interested in getting into a sprint, but I just want to give a little context. So that's how I ended up at the Krakow Jewish Music Festival with Sephardic Tinge the first couple of times, you know, and playing other projects and playing with people. And everybody was talking about Mordecai Gebertig. It's like you always hear Mordecai Gebertig this, Mordecai Gebertig that, Mordecai Gebertig whatever. And then there'd always be some body singing songs of Mordecai Gebertig. He's like the patron saint of the Jewish music of that part of the world and specifically of Krakow. And we'd always take these trips and walk over by his house and look at the plaque that was on his house. And, you know, he was a martyr. He was shot dead in the street. And
yeah, he was born in the 1870s. He was killed on a street corner in Krakow in 1943. But he was the most beloved folk singer of the Jewish community
so much so
in
that people,
Galicia.
So much so that a lot of people don't even know that his songs are his songs and think that they're just folk songs, that he didn't compose them. You know, they've become so much part of the language. But the way that people would sing them, you know, like there's this word that I got from the little bit that I studied theater, you know, which is indicating, like when you indicate the emotion too much, like, you know, and you don't let the listener or the viewer get the emotion, you're like, you know, like, you know, and it's like, and every time I'd hear these people, they'd always be strumming and doing these converting songs and crying, and I was just like, oh, this is not my scene, you know, this is not my world.
Maybe we should hear a little of this as played by Manfred Lem. So this
let's
this
hear it.
song,
That's a good,
S. Brent, Our Town is Burning, was actually written in 1938. It kind of predicted the Holocaust. It was written in response to a pogrom in Poland at that time. How can you stand there with your hands folded? Put out the flames, everybody. Jews, put out these flames. Our town is burning. We're going to hear an East German folk singer.
I need to share the screen again. Sorry, I have to do
that's
that.
good.
Yep. 1 second. All right, here we go.
Unser Ohr im Städtel nimmer brennt. Diese Wind mit ihr gegossen, reißen, brechen und zerblasen, stärker noch die wilde Flammen, als a Rotschein brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt das euch sich, mit verlegter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt das euch sich, unser Städtel brennt.
So that's basically what the song is. So
But
that's part of it.
he actually sings it a little harder edge than a lot of people I've heard, you know.
Oh, sure.
And I've heard some real crying versions, you know.
Sure,
and
sure. Well, Natanya Dovroth has the
I've
famous
played
one.
with people who've done some real crying versions, and they, you know, when it's like Stanislavski says, when you cry and the audience doesn't cry, it's not happening, you know. And that's not exactly how Stanislavski put it, but that was his point. And so like that's how I always felt. But then I was in Krakow one time and I got this gig. Like I was doing a bunch of stuff. Like when you go to Krakow, it's super moving. Like if you could read a lot of these writers, I think like Ruth Gruber, for example, who's written about it, tries to get the fullness of the experience. Where on the one hand, it's like the deepest thing you've ever done in your life, and it's Disneyland at the same time, at the same moment. It just drives you nuts. You don't know how to put it together, and you know, it's just while you're living in it, you're like, how can I be living in this thing? It's amazing. Where am I? What am I doing? You know, and it's so. I was there 4 times, and I really loved it so much. But one of the times they got me this gig to play at the Alchemia, which is the club where the late night jam sessions take place, and to play piano like solo. But they wanted me to play a Jewish repertoire, which I did not have a Jewish repertoire and solo piano. I had a Jewish repertoire with my trio, but I didn't have. So I said, well, you know what? I said to Janusz, the leader of the festival, you know what? Give me all your books of the Polish Jewish repertoire, and I'll just play them like I'm on a club date. I'll just like open them up and I'll just play whatever shows up. I'll play them like somebody comes into the club and says, play Melancholy Baby, except it will be from this repertoire. And then I'll do it in a Cajun way. Like I won't choose anything. I'll just open up the book and whatever song is there. And so one of the songs I opened up was this song. And the insistent rising forth, I was like, man, that is pretty intense. The da 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 da. And later I read that that was the sound of the fire engines when they came to put out the fire. Like that was the sound of the not the alarm of the what, you know, the whatever, the siren. That was the sirens played that forth. And I was just like, this song is incredible. I mean, you know, I'm a sucker for leitmotifs, you know, I like, and you, because those are the things that I can use and make things out of. And that's what and that one really got me. And I thought about it a lot after I played it. And then right after that was 9/11. And there was a series of concerts in the club where we all used to play called Tonic that were benefits after 9/11. And they asked me what I wanted to do. And I knew I wanted to play the song Our Town is Burning. But I didn't want, I wanted to, was going to play a whole set. So what if I put together, I mean, Gebertic has to have other songs that are deep like this. It's got to be, you don't just write one that does this kind of thing. So I got the Gebertic songbook and I tried to throw out of my ears whatever associations I had with Gebertic performance and just kind of put together my own vision of what Gebertic performance could be. And after I had done this set, I sent it to Krakow and I said, listen, I got this thing and I think you're going to like it. And they had me come and do it. And then they had me come and do it again the next year. So, but when I was there in 2005, we recorded it live and that became an album that was recorded in Krakow at midnight in the Kupa Synagogue. And so I had never dealt with that kind of repertoire. So what I did in this particular track is I do a lot with prepared piano, like putting objects into the piano. There's different objects, pieces of metal, and hitting the piano with mallets and using ashtrays. And so I took that forth and I generated it more like as a sound rather than an interval. And I sort of generated the whole piece. Our Town is Burning, unser Städel brennt, or it's brennt. I made the piece using only the material from Gebertic, but using it in that kind of very abstracted way. So that's what
Yeah, let's hear that.
Yeah.
So obviously the reaction was a little bit of shock from that audience, I think.
But they were very positive. It was amazing. I really didn't know what to expect. But it's that kind of thing, like when Thelonious Monk made the Play Duke Ellington album, it's like sometimes when you're in a situation and you doing something outside of the norm, but you do it with a repertoire that people know, sometimes it has a good aspect of bringing people in that wouldn't normally be brought in.
Yeah. So we've gone about 50 minutes here,
By
and
the
I
way,
just
just-
want to ask:
I-
should we
I just-
should we play one more thing, or should we just
Okay,
go
but
to
I want to show
questions?
I just want to show the Salvador's cover because I said I would do it. Can you?
Oh,
see?
sure.
How about a thumbs up if you want to hear one more?
One Sephardic tinge thing, maybe. Jeff is
Yeah, it
saying
looks like
yes.
it, definitely.
Okay. All right.
All right, but I just wanna
So
make
maybe
sure
we
you
should
can see
hear
this
Ghetto
cover.
or
It looks
Moranica.
like it superimposes in front of my background. It's weird.
It's very hard to because of the light. That's the
yeah,
problem. We just keep
strange, yeah.
seeing Moshe Oisher through it. So you could probably put it in the chat later or something.
Okay. Well, let's see. What shall I play?
Well, we were talking about something from Sephardic Tinge, like
but
Ghetto.
you want to hear something more fun than that, I think. Or maybe not. You can hear two things if you want. But this is really fun. You have to hear this.
Okay, fine.
Because if it were not the ending, then okay. But see, here's this piece by Abe Schwartz. I play it for a second. Sadiq Hospital. And back in the early 90s, we thought that sampling was going to change the world. We thought sampling was going to change the world. And it could have. It could have had those schmutzige Magnaten not gotten in the middle of it, as Gebertig says in the song of Remel de Marvikre. Which is to say that they made it so hard to sample anything without getting sued that you eventually could only sample one or two things. But back in the early days of when Public Enemy and John Oswald and all kinds of crazy people were going crazy, like superimposing a sample on top of a sample. Sample looked like it was the future of music. And the combination of Jewish music and sampling, well, you've heard So-Called, and so you know what he does. I don't know how does he get away with it? I'd love to know.
It's all public domain. He never uses
well,
anything
that's the
used in
answer,
public
yeah.
domain.
But we were just grabbing stuff from everywhere. So in this piece, which was on the first record that I made with Roy Nathanson and me, first I'll play you just a minute of Abe Schwartz, Sadiq Hospital, and here it is. So I had an ASR 10 sampler, and I was in love with that baby. So we took samples from Fanny Bryce, from Dave Tarris, from Glenn Miller, from Duke Ellington, from Count Basie, from all over, and we made this. music, or whatever this is.
Well, thank you. So we should go to whatever questions there might be. I
Okay.
know Uri had something that he wanted to ask.
Cool.
Yeah, Uri put it in the chat, but Uri, there's few enough here. Why don't I just unmute you and you can go ahead and ask?
Please.
All
There we
this,
go.
Everything you said.
Hey, Uri.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Sure.
Okay, great. First, thanks a lot for all this, for this conversation and for the music, and this is really awesome. I'm just sort of wondering where you position yourself in relation to the klezmer revival as a movement, as people consider themselves to be part of it, as other people have considered them to be part of it. And I know that it has a lot of baggage, both aesthetically and politically, and different people understand it in different ways. So I'm just wondering, how do you think of yourself and your music in relation to that?
Wait, could you? I'm going to really need you to ask that again. I'm really sorry.
No worries.
Sorry.
So thinking about the klezmer revival, the movement of the klezmer revival, and like all the, the aesthetic musical implications of that, but also the political meanings that sometimes it has. And I know that different people think of this movement in different ways. And I'm just wondering, how do you position yourself in relation to the klezmer revival?
Okay, well, that's a really fabulous question. And okay, oof, okay, let me take a deep breath. So what I mentioned very parenthetically was that sometime around the early 90s, there was, if I can look at the Knitting Factory as a kind of a site, which it kind of was by default, there were two streams of festivals that were going on at the same time, which were radical Jewish culture festivals and klezmer festivals. And a lot of people played in both. I definitely played in both. Many people played in both. But when people have tried, and there have been a lot of theses written about this, what you're asking about, a lot actually, quite surprising how many there have been, how many times I've been interviewed on this subject, and how many articles I've read about it, and how many all the different writing on it. I know that they're not pristine, that the two tracks are not pristine by any means, and like they have so many people in common, and yet it's really important to try to at least, it's like if you were writing about the poetry in New York in the 50s and you wanted to write about the New York school and you wanted to write about the Beat Generation. Obviously they had like all kinds of interactions, they lived in the same neighborhoods, they hung out with the same people, but there's huge differences in the way they saw not just languages, but the way they saw everything from style to painting to everything. They saw things like I've read every book on Frank O'Hara, and just the way the Beat Generation would sit on the floor at their parties was just so different from the way Frank O'Hara saw the world. Like he was not a sit on the floor kind of guy. And it's just like those little things that seem so minor in a way are actually really major. Sometimes they can be really major. And so like it's like a lot of it goes into my having to sort of parse out those nuances if I were going to parse, because my relation to klezmer is very important and also parenthetical at the same time, if that makes any sense. I was never in a band like the Klezmatics, like the way Frank was, for example. Like Frank is in a band like the Klezmatics, and he also does like so many of the radical projects. But the Klezmatics have a meaning way beyond Frank or way beyond any of the people that are in it. They really symbolize a certain kind of, they take up a real space inside of the klezmer revival. But like when I did the Gebertic project, like I could present that project in Krakow, and I could present it twice, and it could be really successful in that context of a Jewish music festival. But if I would step 1 degree to the left, I didn't get like the kind of cred that I would be trusted in terms of like the body of my work was such that you could that I was always having to I always had to reaffirm my bona fides, which got to be very tiring after a while, you know? It's like my bona fides are the bona fides that they are, and I don't want to have to reaffirm them because I feel like that guy in the is it Belgian, that wonderful Belgian painting of the guy walking with the hat who's holding his identity card, you know? Do you know the painting I mean? It's a really
You're thinking of Magritte, or who are you talking?
no. It's a very no. Do you want me to shoot? Hold on,
I'm just
hold on.
thinking of the hat and the
No, no,
Belgian.
no,
But
no,
I
no,
don't
no,
know.
no. If you don't know this painting, you wait. Hold on, 1 second. Uh, wait. If you don't know this pork painting, it's going to change your life. Okay. Well. Wait. It's worth sharing the screen for this. Yes. Okay. 1 second. This painting is a very key image. 1 minute. Sorry. Oh my God, this painting is so.
I think in a sense you already kind of defined the difference by the audience, which is a huge difference.
Okay, wait. Yes, it is. Okay, now can you have I shared my screen yet? No. Okay, so tell me if you can see this. Please tell me if you can see this. Okay. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Felix Nussbaum. You don't know this painting? This painting is unbelievable. Look, I'm going to put it in full screen. This guy did not survive the Holocaust, but he painted this during the Holocaust. You see, he's Belgian because you see the thing. It's in both languages. It's in Flemish and French. Isn't that painting unbelievable? There's a Felix Nussbaum museum now.
How does that relate to what you're
No, I'm just saying it's like no, it's just that haunted image is just incredible. It doesn't relate at all. It's just like it's just like that. It doesn't relate except in that feeling of like when I would. It's just riffing. It's just riffing. But what I'm saying in the riffing is like when with the scene, it's like there are people whose bona fides are very clear, and then there's people who they have to constantly be showing their identity card, you know, and it's like. So what happened was on a street corner in Krakow in the middle of the festival, oh God, I so much want to curse. You can't imagine how much I want to curse. Some MF came up to me, some jive guy who plays the violin and writes these kind of simpering orchestral klezmer pieces, which are just basically folk pieces transcribed for orchestra. And he says, I know why I do this music, but why do you do this music? And I just like had to tie my hands behind my back because I was like, you don't do nothing. What do you actually do? You don't you take themes that already exist and you turn them into these simpery orchestrated versions. What do you actually what do you mean what you do? You don't do nothing. I do something. But I didn't say that. I just said, yeah, I hear what you're talking about. You know, that's amazing. Goodbye. And it was just like I just had this feeling I cannot have this conversation anymore with these, you know, I cannot have this conversation with these people all the time. It's like, not like everybody needs to love my work. I do not need everybody to love my work at all, you know? But that's one of the big differences. It's like there's an idea of like bona fides in the klezmer scene that are like affirmed. That this other scene, it was tricky, like what the bona fides were was very fluid. Some people didn't represent them at all in terms of musical signifiers. Like if you look at what Mark Rebo called these, you see, I was very interested in musical signifiers. So those were very key to me. But if you look at the music that Mark Rebo put out under the Sodic Jewish Culture series, you know, you might not find any Jewish signifiers. They were all in the text, for example. And that's what like Homeboy jumped on. He jumped on that. What's his name? You know, Hankus. He jumped all over that.
Klezkamp. Henry Sapoznik?
That's what Henry jumped all over. Was like these people are just dealing with questions of identity, and I was like, oh, you know, oh my goodness, they're not really dealing. They haven't really done the work, you know. And I was like, what is the work? As though there's one work, you know. Like, what is the work? Like, there's all kinds of work. I agree with him only to one little point, which is like, if you're doing music and you're not dealing with the signifiers of music, that's not enormously interesting to me. I'll be honest, you know? Like, I like music that deals with the signifiers of music, actually. But there were many ways that people came about it. Whereas in klezmer, there's always like this thing of like the constant affirmation of like when you go to these things, there's so much like I learned it from the last guy who learned it from the last guy before he died. I'm the guy who was the last guy to hold the book. I was the last guy who saw the last guy before the last guy held the book, before the guy died who had the book before the guy, you know, and it's like, oh, you know, I have plenty of bona fides if you want, but I don't want to be sitting there and claiming them all the time. So that I think, as Hankus said, I've already explained what the difference is. But so like it's kind of a gadfly position. It's kind of like I don't care. It's kind of like I care too much. It's kind of like it's all very interesting. The political stuff, like where they put it together with queer culture and stuff like that, that's really important to the people. It's really important to. I'm totally. That's marvelous. You know, when I go into the room and everybody's singing Olive Breeder, I'm like, I feel the same way as the people who think we're going to get the WPA back, you know? It's a beautiful dream.
All right, I think we have one last question
Sorry,
and then we'll
that
wrap.
was a rant. That was a rant. Sorry.
Thank you for the and for all the layers of this. I really appreciate it.
Jeff Janesco.
Yeah, well, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I'm a big admirer of what you have done on Sodic, which was why I was a little dismayed, and you may have just answered the question here with that. We can describe it as a rant, but it was brilliant all the same. You described.
Well, we are sometimes. Did you ever get that book called Rants?
No.
It's a collection of the world's most brilliant rants. You definitely need to get it. It's amazing.
Well, you should be in the next edition of it. You described S. Brent as being the end of your story. Is that related to what you were just talking
It
about?
is very much related to the end of my story. I've never done a full-fledged 100% Jewish project since then, although I have done many performances with many people, and I've done many records with people, and I've definitely engaged with Jewish music, and I always will. It's very much a part of my life since then.
Well, we should. But you did a project because I just wanted to say
part of a project. That's
right.
what I'm saying.
But it was a major piece.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
There was a piece. I mean, I'm just going to say this because
Okay.
2 years ago, on the 150th anniversary of New England Conservatory, which is the oldest music school in the country, they commissioned composers to write for the orchestra, for the jazz department, and for the contemporary improvisation department. And Anthony was the composer commissioned, and he wrote quite a suite of pieces inspired by all kinds of things. But one of the things that had happened just before the commission was the Parkland massacre, and it was such a riveting event, and there was definitely a Jewish dimension to this and an anti-Semitic dimension to this. And Emma Lopez, for example, who was very much the spokesperson for the survivors.
Emma, not Lopez.
I'm sorry.
Gonzalez.
Emma Gonzalez. I confused her with Anna Lopez all of a sudden. Emma Gonzalez, who was very much a spokesperson, who I believe was half Jewish, was somebody who was called froth by a politician, right? It was
that she was frothing. Yeah.
Right. That this was, and so Anthony actually commissioned, I think, Michael Wex to help us.
No, he didn't end up doing it.
But,
it was a bunch of other people. It was
Yuri Vedanyapin, a Yiddish teacher,
and Dan also,
and Daniel Kahn, Yeah. And they wrote a text that contextualized this as a Yiddish, in kind of almost like a Yiddish uprising around this massacre. Can you talk about that some more?
I can talk about it a lot. I mean, I read this article, and it was an article that I could send you I could put the link up.
It was in Haaretz.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about that for 1 second, please.
Well, it was an article that basically was looking at the fact that the guy who did the shooting was a rabid anti-Semite, and he had posted on all kinds of anti-Semitic websites, and what he was off to do was kill Jewish students in particular.
And what the woman was saying in the article was that they had the 17 crosses, and that was really an unbelievable insult. You know, that the fact that, like, at the memorial service there were only crosses, 17 crosses for the dead kids, even though it was so clearly an attack that had a lot of basis in anti-Semitism. Can I play the beginning of the piece? Or
yes, yes, I think
even
you should.
Even though it's waiting for its good recording, it's really waiting for its good recording.
Do we want to play this and make it the last thing just because?
Yeah,
I know
yeah. Okay. That's fine. But I think it's great.
But actually, you didn't ask your question, so I want you to ask your question.
I think you
Jeff.
kind of did. Jeff, do you feel like you asked your question?
I was asking you to describe, to say why a sprint was the end of your story. Yeah.
Because I mean, I think it wasn't really.
No. I just said it was the end of my story of, like, fully, like, a record, a CD that is all, like, you know what I'm saying. Like,
I know what you're saying. Yeah. No,
yeah.
I feel like you answered the question. Thank you. And I'm
cool.
excited to hear what you're about to play.
Cool. Great. All right, here it comes. 1 second. All right. Wait 1 minute, please. I have to share a screen again.
Oh yes. This is the new etiquette of Zoom.
Yeah.
We must share screens.
Just let me know if you don't hear it, okay?
Klein Kind to a Gestrei. Schrei euch durch der ganzen Welt. Klein Kind to a Gestrei. Volker Babuster Hasser von Minoriteiten, gerecht auf den Offenheit von sein sie nicht, zu jedem nur zu etwas, a andere Minorität dennoch geacht, ein Schießere in der Schule, soll a viel, sein du selbe Schul, wo allein ist a Mordgebener Talmid. Boyu, my sugar na hund, closer than go cup. 17 crosses. 17 crosses. Klein Kind to a Gestrei. Schrei euch durch den ganzen Welt. Oh, meine kleine
So I don't know. I think that's really incredible.
I want to say two things about the text because there were two things that were really important to me about the text. Just so I really wanted the word Emma's to be really key because of Emma Gonzalez, you know? So that was really important to me. Like, obviously, Emma's is like, that's going to be, like, and that goes back to my love for the Barton Brothers and the song,
Arriba, Arriba.
Arriba. If you want to believe it, it's true. If you want to believe it, it's true. As the Emmett statement, the Zaginish statement, that it could happen to you, you know? So that's been an important word to me going all the way back, you know? So, but then with Emmis and Emma Gonzalez was really key. And that had, so that was one of the rules. And the other rule was when I had a German girlfriend, and she was once explaining to me how her father was not an anti-Semite. He said, no, he wasn't an anti-Semite. I mean, every once in a while, when we were too loud, he would say, "Hier, es hat ein Lärm wie ein Judenschule," and but that was just an expression. So it's noisy here, like in a Jewish school, for those who don't get it. And so I thought, since that's what we were doing about Judenschule, was going to have to be a really important word in the text here for me, because the whole thing being about Schrei, that they have to stand up and they have to.
Give a geschrei.
Yeah.
So that the Judenschule was stand up and cry and scream about this.
So it was going to be, and then having Dan was really important because Dan lives in Berlin, so he could vibe that vibe really nicely for me, you know, and that really worked well.
Yeah. So that was, I mean, I thought that was a major piece from only 2 years ago. So
yeah. No, I
Awesome.
know. Like I say, it's very central to my concept. It's never going to go away, but it has changed in terms of, like, I don't need anybody to like it. I don't need anybody to think that it's what it is. They can think whatever they want about it. They can invite me, not invite me. It's all good.
Well, with that, we are glad that we invited you
Thank you,
to
and I'm
participate
so glad
in
you
it.
Thank you so
invited me.
much.
With that, if everyone wants to take, unmute yourselves and give like a real applause, feel free. We are very glad
Thank you. Thank you.
much for doing this, Anthony and Hankus. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, continue to stay safe and healthy. We will be back in the same place next week with Michael Hunter Oakes. So please do join us. It should be a really interesting conversation. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.